Welcome to the premiere episode of Herstory, where we chronicle women's contributions throughout history and highlight their impact on major aspects of life in areas of science, business, human rights, politics, religion, sports, entertainment, and culture. Annually, March is Women's History Month, and we dedicate only 31 days to celebrate the contributions that women have made to our world. However, women make up 50% of our world. Doesn't it make sense that we should continually celebrate women's contributions? Oxford University history professor Margaret Macmillan said, "We can learn from history, but we can also deceive ourselves when we selectively take evidence from the past to justify what we have already made up our minds to do." History is recorded based upon who is telling the story. Hasn't the time come for women to tell their story? When people are inspired by others' challenges and accomplishments, it helps provide a foundation for their own goals and dreams. Think about that one teacher or professor when you were growing up, or perhaps a grandparent or parent or someone famous that changed the way you saw your life. Her story starts the discussion of women's great accomplishments and how that impacts our life and our society. Think about how a pop star influences young girls and how they act and dress. Remember back in the 1980s when girls tried to emulate Madonna or Cyndi Lauper? For a couple of decades, Disney television shows helped shape how girls acted and dressed. Although maybe not nearly as exciting, what if we had a constant conversation about great women who people don't know much about or often don't think about? How would that inspire girls and women, and even boys and men? Women like the first women astronauts at NASA. Did you know that Margaret Ray Seddon of Murfreesboro is one of the 6 first female astronauts to enter the NASA program? And the first woman on the U.S. Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor in 1981. The first woman Indy Race Series winner and NASCAR driver, Danica Patrick. Okay, now that is exciting. 2020 just marked the 100th year anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which recognized women's right to vote and to participate directly in their government. So significant. For almost 2/3 of our country's official existence, about 150 years, 1/2 of our population, women, were not directly participating in who was elected to represent them. The elections last year gave us the first woman in the White House, Vice President Kamala Harris. Last year, we set a new record for women serving in the U.S. Congress. The 117th Congress has 143 women. The previous record was set in 2019, and the 2020 election marks a 12.6% increase over 2019. Impressive. One important woman in this arena is Jeannette Rankin, the first woman elected to the U.S. Congress. She was actually elected for 2 different terms, once to the House and once to the Senate. Rankin grew up in Montana, and one of her childhood observations was that while women of the 1890s Western frontier labored side by side as equals with men, they did not have an equal political voice, nor a legal right to vote. Rankin was active in the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and during the 1910s, she coordinated the efforts of a variety of grassroots organizations to promote her suffrage campaigns in New York and Montana, and later in North Dakota. She would draw from the same grassroots infrastructure during her 1916 congressional campaign. Think about that. She was the first woman elected to Congress, the House of Representatives, from Montana in 1916, 4 years before women had the right to vote. In 2015, when Saudi Arabia granted voting rights to women, this means that now every woman in every country that has elections can vote. Fascinating stuff. We could run a whole series of episodes on just this one topic, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. This episode introduces her story by reviewing just a few lesser-known women who made important contributions for women and society at large. We highlight the recent work done by the Unladylike 2020 Project and by the National Women's History Museum. We highly encourage you to explore these excellent resources and start a conversation about just one woman's story that might inspire you or your daughter, or your sister, or your wife, or your mother. Women in history have stories to tell. These extraordinary tales of discovery, reform, and revolution lie hidden in the pages of history that have rarely seen the light of day. But we feel it's vital to tell the whole story, the story of how these women did their part to shape the foundations of the present world. We are here to tell her story. In the late 1700s, women did not have the right to vote, but they could certainly work and invent. The 1790 Patent Act allowed any person or persons to petition for protection of their original methods and designs, and this included women. And even though patents granted to women were few and far between, they made significant contributions over the ages. On May 5, 1809, Mary Keyes was the first woman to be awarded a patent. Her patent was for a new technique of weaving straw with silk and thread to make hats. Keyes' method created low-cost bonnets for working women, as well as giving New England's hat economy a boost. Her patent was signed by President James Madison. Unfortunately, fashion changed, and she did not profit from her invention. Another unknown early inventor was Margaret Knight, who in 1868 invented a machine that folded and glued paper to form the brown paper bags used in grocery stores today. She built a wooden prototype, but needed a working iron model to apply for a patent. Before she could file the patent, a male co-worker at the Columbia Paper Bag Company stole her design and patented the device. Knight filed a successful patent interference lawsuit and was awarded the patent in 1871. Knight is often referred to as the female Edison and holds approximately 26 patents. Nearly a decade later, Maria Beasley, who like Knight held several patents, filed a patent that improved the design of life rafts. With her updated design, she ensured that the life raft would be airtight to protect any provisions, as well as ensure when the raft was lowered into the water, it would not be damaged. Beasley's updated design of the life raft was used on the RMS Titanic in April 1912. Though there were not enough lifeboats on board to save all 2,217 passengers, 20 lifeboats that the ship did carry saved the lives of 700 people. Lillian Mahler Gilbreth blazed a trail with her inventions in the workplace. Using her doctoral degree in psychology, Gilbreth analyzed how improvements to efficiency impacted the employees' dedication to their jobs.
1912, Providence, Rhode Island. 34-year-old Lillian Mola Gilbreth and her husband Frank introduced workers at a manufacturing plant to what's known as scientific management.
Frank studies the motions and how you can economize on the motions. Everything's done by the stopwatch. He times workers and he says, how can we make this faster, faster, faster? But Lillian is interested in worker satisfaction. She's looking at their faces. How do I make them happier with the work they're doing?
She thought about the workplace environment. Maybe there needed to be more light. Maybe there needed to be bigger windows. Maybe the workers needed to take a break.
And that is the one little element that's going to separate the Gilbreth system from all the other scientific managers out there. That's their innovation, and it's Lillian's.
By 1910, the Gilbreths opened their own consulting practice with clients ranging from camera to rubber manufacturers.
They invent this idea of Thurbligs, which is Gilbreth spelled backwards. And they believe that every activity that goes on is some combination of these 17 actions. Frank understands that most of his clients need to see Lillian as the assistant. But the truth is that she's the one starting to really revolutionize this idea of industrial psychology.
She didn't think just of how the technology worked, but she thought about how it would affect the people that were using it. I'm Lisa Cicataluca. I'm a distinguished engineer, a director, and an inventor at IBM. I'm now working for our Watson Internet of Things division at IBM is this concept that all of the things around us can connect to each other and to the internet to share information. And a lot of that is putting yourself in the shoes of the everyday worker. What do they need? What kind of technology will help them do their job better? So we're thinking about innovation exactly the same way that Lillian did.
Lillian Gilbreth earned a PhD in psychology from Brown University in 1915, but found it difficult to get her work published. Although she co-wrote many of Frank's early books, she rarely got the credit.
Sometimes her name's on there, but if it's on there, it's L.M. Gilbreth, so no one thinks it's a woman that's writing these papers.
Gilbreth received public recognition in 1921 when she became the first woman honorary member of the Society of Industrial Engineers.
This was a complete surprise and a tremendous thrill.
However, after Frank's death in 1924, most corporate clients canceled their contracts, unwilling to take Lillian Gilbreth seriously.
And so, along with grieving her husband, now she has to reinvent herself. I'm going to focus on things that people think I can legitimately do as a woman. Women's work, and quite literally, this woman has her own solo career for the next 50 years.
Gilbreth invented the L-shaped kitchen, the foot pedal trash can, refrigerator shelving, and many other home efficiency designs.
She's basically infusing that domestic role of the homemaker with value.
From 1935 to 1948, Gilbreth was the first female professor at Purdue University's School of Engineering.
What's beautiful about that time in her life is all of those innovations she brought to Frank's work are now considered legitimate, an actual academic discipline.
In 1965, Gilbreth was the first woman elected to the National Academy of Engineering. She retired in 1968 at age 90, having put all 11 of her surviving children through college.
50 years after Gilbreth's passing, the number of U.S. women inventors awarded patents is still only 12.8%. We still have a long way to go. Women in history often have stories to tell. Many of the women in this first episode of Herstory were independent and often referred to as new women, meaning they were educated and wanted to put that education to good use. One of these new women was Jane Addams, and like the other women in Herstory, she had big aspirations to do something useful in the world. During her 75 years on Earth, Addams was an American settlement activist, reformer, public administrator, and author. She was an important leader in the history of social work and women's suffrage in the United States and an advocate for world peace. However, it was an article about settlement houses she read in the summer of 1887 that called to her. Settlement houses were located in poor urban areas where volunteer middle-class settlement workers would live, hoping to share knowledge and culture with their low-income neighbors. Jane Addams wanted to see firsthand what the settlement houses offered, but in 1887, the United States did not have any, so Addams traveled to London and visited Toynbee Hall, one of the first settlement houses on record. Because of the great success she witnessed at Toynbee Hall, she immediately began planning her own settlement house. Addams and her friend Ellen Gates Starr found a rundown mansion called Hull House in Chicago. Hull House was built by Charles Hull in 1856 and was in need of a good fixer-upper. Too bad HGTV did not exist in the 1800s. After completing the renovations, Addams and Starr were the first two occupants of the house that would later become the residence of about 25 women. The women of Hull House were a team who provided services to thousands of people each week. They established a kindergarten and a daycare for working mothers, provided job training and classes for immigrants, such as English language. One of those women was Grace Abbott, and like Addams, she wanted to do more.
Grace Abbott was born in 1878 in Grand Island, Nebraska, to a Quaker family of activists.
Her father was the only lawyer in town. He had been a soldier in the Union Army and an abolitionist. The mother was a very important leader in the suffrage movement. She was friends with Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, both of whom stayed in the Abbott's house.
My mother would say to my sister Edith and me, "Even if you are little girls, you can be suffragists too, because it is right and just." I always was happy in Nebraska, but there isn't much opportunity for a girl in a small city, and it seemed inevitable that I leave.
In 1908, at age 29, Abbott left to attend the University of Chicago, where she planned to study law. But she ended up residing at Hull House, co-founded by future Nobel Prize winner Jane Addams. It was one of the first among hundreds of settlement houses nationwide working to address social problems and provide services to new immigrants.
Women in the settlement movement were among the most important Americans involved in the establishment of social work as a profession. Hull House was right there in the middle of an area full of Greek, Italian, Eastern European, Jewish, and so forth.
Rotting stables were everywhere, and the alleys were indescribably filthy. The tenements were tiny, sordid rooms with no windows, no electricity, no water. They were beyond description.
Despite the fact that women didn't have the right to vote, they played a critical role in working with immigrants in settlement houses.
During a time of widespread anti-immigrant sentiment, Abbott served as director of the Immigrants Protective League from 1908 to 1917. She defended asylum seekers from deportation, testified in court against the trafficking of women, and lobbied against policies meant to exclude non-English-speaking immigrants.
A great means for enriching our national life is lost if we neglect all but the Anglo-Saxon in our population.
In 1921, Abbott became director of the U.S. Children's Bureau, making her the highest-ranking woman in government.
By the mere fact of her existence as a woman achieving at that level, she was being a champion of women's rights, to prove that a woman could have these jobs and excel at them.
Abbott resigned from the Children's Bureau in 1934, but she continued working on drafts of the Social Security Act until it was passed the following year.
She was the only trained social worker at the top levels of American government at the onset of the Great Depression, and her work led the way to the creation of the Federal Emergency Relief Effort, also of the Fair Labor Standards Act to combat child labor, and of Social Security Act, which continues to greatly benefit millions of Americans.
Both Abbott and Addams never married, but instead dedicated themselves to lending their voice to those who were not always heard, such as children, immigrants, and the poor. In 1917, Abbott joined her former Chicago colleague, Julia Lathrop, in Washington at the Children's Bureau of the U.S. Department of Labor as director of the Industrial Division. She worked there until 1934. Like Abbott, Addams had other causes, and as a pacifist did not agree with the U.S. entry into World War I and made her a target for criticism. In 1915, she headed the Women's Peace Party and helped found the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in 1919. In 1931, Addams was the first American woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She died 4 years later. We've given you some stories about women inventors and reformers, but what about the early entertainers, specifically African American women? Who were some of the early performers that paved the way for present-day artists? Born in 1869, Matilda Ciceretta Joyner, better known by her stage name, Ciceretta Jones, started by singing in her father's church and in 1883 formally studied music at the Providence Academy of Music. In the late 1880s, she was accepted at the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston.
1892, New York, New York. 24-year-old Ciceretta Jones sang opera at the newly built Madison Square Garden Concert Hall to an audience of thousands.
Unfortunately, we have today no recordings of her voice. There were very few African Americans who recorded at that time, but we have many descriptions of her voice from the press, how powerful it was and the emotion and the sympathy that you could hear when she sang. she'll be limited to concert appearances because there isn't any opportunity for her to sing in opera. Opera companies weren't hiring African American singers, and most white American musicians were not going to appear on the same stage with Ciceretta.
In 1888 and 1890, Jones and the troupe toured throughout the Caribbean to packed, racially mixed concert halls. The second tour was managed by an all-black team, including her husband.
That's where she was given the title of the greatest singer of her generation. And she was given all of these medals and precious jewels.
And the more she acquired, the more she pinned on her chest.
Jones soon became known as the Black Patty, a comparison to Italian opera star Adelina Patti.
It rather annoys me to be called the Black Patty. But I have a voice, and I am striving to win the favor of the public by honest merit and hard work.
To be so gifted in these times as a Black person, I can imagine was one of the most frustrating things, because she couldn't just be Ciceretta Jones. She had to be the Black Patty, which was demeaning.
In 1892, Jones sang at the White House for President Benjamin Harrison and reportedly performed for 3 other U.S. presidents. The following year, she became the first African-American woman to headline a concert on the main stage at Carnegie Hall, slated on the same program as noted abolitionist Frederick Douglass. After touring Europe, where she performed for emperors, kings, and princes, the tide of Jones's career turned. The U.S. Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling ushered in a new era of segregation and racial violence.
Racism at that point with the Jim Crow laws made it 10 times more difficult for her to succeed.
They tell me that my color is against me, but I am proud of what I am.
At a time when minstrel shows performed in blackface stereotyped and demeaned Black culture, Jones became the star of the Black Patty Troubadours, a popular vaudeville show made up of 50 African-American acrobats, comedians, dancers, and trained singers.
For the next 19 years, she was on the road. They would travel by rail, and they would go from one city to the next, 42 to 45 weeks a year, 5 or 6 cities in a week.
In 1915, Jones retired to care for her mother. She lived off her earnings for many years, but eventually had to sell most of her property to survive, including all of her trademark medals and jewels. Upon her death in 1933, she didn't have the money for a gravestone, but in 2018, money was raised and a gravestone was erected. Though she was born nearly 3 decades after Jones, opera singer Marian Anderson faced many of the same struggles as a Black performer. Because of her race, Anderson had few concert opportunities. However, she appeared with the Philadelphia Symphony and toured African-American Southern college campuses. She made her European debut in Berlin in 1930 and appeared in European tours in 1930 through 1935. She also performed for monarchs of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and England. But in 1939, when she attempted to rent concert facilities in Washington, D.C.'s Constitution Hall that was owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution, she was refused because of her race. This sparked widespread protests from many people, including Eleanor Roosevelt, who resigned from the DAR. In April of that same year, arrangements were made for Anderson to appear at the Lincoln Memorial. More than 75,000 people attended the outdoor concert. On January 7, 1955, she became the first African-American singer to perform as a member of the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. Anderson was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1963. It was President John F. Kennedy who, prior to his assassination, reestablished the award and expanded its scope to include cultural achievements. The first recipients, selected by Kennedy, received their medals from his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, just weeks after President Kennedy's death. In 1965, Anderson retired from singing. We would like to again acknowledge the work done by the Unladylike 2020 Project and by the National Women's History Museum. I was amazed to learn that the National Women's History Museum is an online museum and not a physical museum. Yet, 25 years ago, the founders were certainly amazed that women's history was largely missing from our nation's capital, including the Smithsonian Institution. This motivated Karen Stazer to found the museum effort in 1995. Check out this project at womenshistory.org. And we especially want to thank Charlotte Mangan, creator and producer of the Unladylike 2020 Project, which provided the excellent video content in this episode. Her talented team of 30 pulled off this project last year during the pandemic, and it aired on PBS American Masters. They tell in depth the story of 26 little-known, trend-setting American women, beautifully done. Check them out at unladylike2020.com. We highly encourage you to explore these excellent resources and start a conversation about just one woman's story that might inspire you. It's time to tell her story. Please visit us at herstory.tv and let us know what you think. We'll see you on another upcoming episode. Until then, thank you for watching Her Story.